my presentation. Well, we are more or less right in the middle of the presentation or of the debate. We already have discussed a lot about quality. We found some very nice and appropriate definitions of quality. So I'm going to give you, first of all, give you my definition of quality. And it's as simple as that. Quality means the customer comes back, not the translation. And why is it so important that the customer comes back? Why is it important that the customer comes back? Well, exactly right, because at the end of the day, we make a living on them. We all live on our customers. And I can tell you that it is at least 10 times more expensive to get in new clients than to keep the ones we already have. And I've seen many companies from inside as a quality auditor. I've got the emphasis, I'm not a translator myself. My background is now conformity assessment, and my PhD degree is from physics, so I've got nothing to do with translation. Anyhow, I've seen many companies from inside as an auditor, and most of these companies work with long-term clients. There's only a small proportion of them who have, let's say, day-by-day clients. Most of them have only a few of them, but these are big clients, and they have been working with them for many years. So, and that's the reason, and that's also the reason why this statement of the old Mr. Royce is right to say quality keeps and maintains in the mind of the people whenever the price is long forgotten, because for all these long-term clients, price is not the big issue. Price is not the thing they are looking for. They are looking for a reliable, stable, and quality service provider. So, and that's what I would like to discuss with you a bit also on the issue of quality standards. Basically, I'm going to talk about one quality standard, which is the European standard, EN 15038, and Ravi has put the question, why is there a European standard, why is there a Chinese standard, why is there a Canadian standard, why is there an American standard, why isn't there an international standard? Well, at least from the European point of view, I can tell you, well, actually there's no specific reason behind it. It's a pure coincidence that people in Europe, an industry association here, started the process, and basically they started it in the framework of the European standardization system. They could have well done the same from the very beginning at the ISO level. So it's nothing specific, and as my predecessor speaker has already mentioned, it's very likely that in some years' time to come, we will have an international standard on quality in translation services. I would like to start my presentation with the permission of Professor Bell. Quote him, the professional translator has a responsibility for the adequacy of the translated text and for its suitability for the client. This requires competence, ethical behavior, and procedural appropriateness. Well, actually, I couldn't have better summarized the European standard and all the translation quality standards which are around, because at the end of the day, this is it, and this is what translation quality and translation quality standards are about. So I could end my statement and end my presentation at this very point, which I don't do. But if we look at the essence of all these standards which are around, it's exactly about that. It's about competence, it's about behavior, and it's about procedures. I'd like to show you that on the example of the European standard. So this is how it looks like. This is the title page. And again, EN 15038. That's a number I ask you to remember. You might see it more and more in the future, also here in India, I hope. So the standard itself has been published in the year 2006, so almost 3 years ago, and it specifies requirements for the service providers with regards to human and technical resources, quality, project management, the contractual framework, and service procedures. So exactly that what we have already mentioned: competence, behavior, and procedures. So this is what the standard is about. And the introduction tells a bit about the reasons why we did it, or why this standard has been published. Well, again, at the end of the day, it's as simple as that they wanted to provide a framework for providing quality. They wanted to provide a means of communication between the client and the service provider, because I can tell you another secret from my journeys through the TSPs all around Europe. At the end of the day, everything is about communicating with your client. And this is what I have to admit, well, at least, to say the least, there is potential for improvement on this communication with your client. Because who tells you what the client needs? Who tells you at the end of the day what is an adequate text? Well, at the end of the day, it's the client who tells you. So you need to communicate. But not only you need to communicate with him, but also because I always say the client is stupid, and he has the right to be stupid because you are professionals. So you are supposed to advise him on what he needs. You are supposed to give him advice. Well, listen, this is the best way to be done. Of course, at the end of the day, he needs to sign the contract. He needs to tell you, well, okay, listen, this is what I need. But you are supposed to advise him. So this is what I expect from the companies I do audit and I do certify, that they communicate actively with their clients and that they provide them with advice. So it's the objective, as I already mentioned, is to provide a sort of means also for proper communication between client and translation service provider, but also, to put it short, to provide something like the state of the art. We all know the concept of the state of the art when it comes to technology, when it comes to machinery industry, when it comes to building a building. We know what state of the art in terms of creating and building such a building. The concept of the state of the art might be or might sound new to a business like yours. So you might say, well, who is supposed to tell me what's the state of the art? Well, this is the purpose of such a standard like this, to say, well, these steps to be done and these competencies to have, this is what we're supposed, the state of the art. It's supposed to be minimum standards in terms of this is the level you must comply with. You may, of course, do more, you may be more competent, of course, than the standard. You may have stricter procedures, you may have more communication with the clients than required, of course. Don't please mistake this as this is the thing to be done and nothing more. It's exactly the opposite. This is the minimum to be done in terms of this is the state of the art. You're supposed to do that, of course, in order to be successful and maybe in order to overdo your competitors, you might do a bit more even. So again, these are minimum standards, not to be mistaken for, well, that's the thing to be done and nothing more. That's the structure of the standard. It's got some clauses. It starts with a clause on terms and definition. We already had it. Of course, you can't standardize before you don't agree on certain terms. For example, the TSP itself, or things like, and you may then hear some other terms like revision and review and all these sort of things. And we kept discussing about terms like this for hours and hours. You can't imagine how long it takes to agree on simple terms. At least it might seem to be simple, but it turns out sometimes that a simple word like to revise, for example, is used differently, and of course it takes quite a long time then to agree on one concept of a term like to revise, for example. So basic requirements, you will see later on what this means. Then, most important, as I said, the client translation service provider relationship. So it's about communicating with each other about the project. It's about procedures again, and a chapter on added value services and some very useful annexes. These annexes are informative, so they are not mandatory in terms of you've got to meet them in terms of meet the standards. but we give some useful hints how to work in practice. To give you a few examples and to give you the most basic and common concepts of the standard, first of all, it's the TSP itself. This is to be defined as a person or an organization supplying translation services. Well, it might sound simple, but it's important to emphasize at this point, this standard is not about agencies alone. So a one-man band, one person, man or woman, could be a translation service provider, as long, of course, as he or she meets the competence requirements, as long as he and she follows the procedures. But and we already did that in terms of certification. We already did certify single translators as translation service providers. So you don't have to be a company to be a translation service provider in the sense of the standards. The translator, of course, it comes down at the end of the day to a person doing the job. As long as the machine don't do it for us, it's persons doing the job. And by the way, to mention that, as I've been asked this question before, well, when we talk about translator, we mean persons. So in order to meet the standard, you must not replace one translator by a machine, which was a question which I've been already asked. So it must be living persons, a real person doing the translations. So one of the core of the standard, again, this is exactly that what Professor Bell is pointing out, is competence. So the translation service provider shall have a procedure to select the appropriate people, to select the people required for the project. Of course, you can't standardize the people, but you can standardize the procedure, and you can say, this is my selection procedure in terms of to find out who is appropriate for my needs as a translation service provider. When it comes to the competencies of the translators themselves, which is of course again the core of the whole thing, the standard defines 5 core competences for a translator to have. The one is, of course, goes without saying, translating competence, linguistic and textual competence in source and target language, which is a bit different and something else than translating competence. It takes also, of course, in particular nowadays, research competence, competence on how to acquire information and how to process information. Cultural competence was already mentioned, of course, localization, to know where and how the target market, if I may use this term, how the target market works, how the target culture works, and how not only the science, what does the science mean, but also again, when it comes to translation, what does words mean in specific language and in their cultural context. And last but not least, nowadays, you need technical competence. So I think nowadays no one would ever have the idea to hire any more translators who do the translations in handwriting only on pieces of paper. So we have to require a bit more technical competence also. So these are the 5 core competences the standard defines, which it takes to be a competent translator. It goes on to define other functions in the processes, which is a reviser. We're going to see later on what revision means and what a reviser is supposed to be. A reviewer is something, someone who has domain competence, so a technical specialist in the field where the translation is happening. So we've been talking, for example, about the automotive industry. A reviewer would be a specialist in the automotive industry. It doesn't have to be bilingual, because what he's supposed to do is read the target text in his or her language, and by means of his or her technical competence decide where, well, at the end of the day, terminology is right, again, terminology, and where the use of the terms is appropriate. So this is a review. And also seen anything else, never having read a book or something else, never having received maybe actually what it means here, at least not in its full extent. So it doesn't require a full ISO 9000 quality management system just to meet the standard. But of course what it means is that you've got appropriate control mechanisms in place, in particular when it comes to interfaces, which means the client and the TSP is one interface, the TSP, the project manager, and the translators outside. Both these are interfaces. In particular, when it comes to these interfaces, you've got to have control procedures in place so that to make sure that what at the one end of the chain the client requests comes down to the translator and then back to the client. So this is what it actually means when the standard says quality management system. It requires, of course, technical resources. As I already have said, the standard doesn't specify in detail what this means in terms of this is the thing to have. It doesn't say, for example, you need to have CAT tools. I mean, it might do so in some years to come, because in some years' time, maybe it is really the state of the art in terms this is the thing to have, and without it, you can't do. For the moment, it simply says you need to have the technical resources required by your translation project. So, depending on for what sort of client you work, depending on what size of projects you work, of course, you need to have more and more technical resources available. Projects need to be managed. This is of course recognized and acknowledged by the standard. Therefore, we need a person being a project manager. Again, of course, when it comes to a one-man band, when it comes to a one-man company, meaning the person could do all these functions within one individual. Of course. So I could be my own translator and project manager. This is clear. So it doesn't have to be a separate person. I mean, the bigger the company is, of course, the more specialized the functions will be, and then of course you will have your own project managers, which is the usual thing, what we see in agencies at least, project managers. Well, this is a quote from the standard. I don't want to bother you on this. So, next clause. Again, one of the most important one is client-TSP relationship. So, it's about inquiry and feasibility. So, you are the one, again, who has to react appropriately to an inquiry of a client. And again, this is also my personal opinion, you need to advise the client. You need to actually talk to him, not only, well, this is what he tells me. Well, usually I can tell you, the client don't tell you too much, if at all, something. So that's the usual setup to say, translate this. Then you've got to ask what language. Okay. So anyhow, so of course, and you are the one supposed to ask some questions to say, well, listen, what is maybe the target audience? What's the purpose? Is it a workshop like this? Is it to be published? Which might be a difference. Of course, time restraints and so on and so on. So again, you are professionals and you are supposed to communicate with your clients. So inquiry and feasibility. Quotation, important thing, at the end of the day it's about business, at the end of the day it's about paying money for a service. Therefore, we are supposed to offer a quotation to the client, tell him, well, this is what it's going to cost, and this is, at least, you've got to tell him this is the time frame I'm going to achieve this project within this time frame. It also talks about a client-TSP agreement. Again, a concept where sometimes misunderstandings occur. It doesn't have to be a written, mutually signed paper when we talk about agreement. But what it takes is, at least, and this, at the end of the day, it's a sort of piece of paper where it is written down to say, this is what I'm going to do for you until when and how, so that it's clear for you and the client what you have agreed on, what you're going to do, until when, and what it's going to cost. So it doesn't have to be a formally signed contract, but it must be clear and it must be traceable and must be recorded what you have agreed on with the client. For your own sake as a TSP, I can tell you to do that. because in particular when the client is not satisfied with your service, well, they tend to be a bit nasty on this and to say, well, listen, this is not what we have agreed on. We have agreed half the price you're now going to ask me for. So, for your own sake, record that, make it clear, listen, this is what we have agreed on, what, when, who, whatever, who is responsible, and so on. The standard also talks a bit how to handle project-related client information. At the end of the day, you have to handle it in the way you specified it with the client, if you did so. And there must be a dedicated project conclusion. It means there must be a dedicated and visible, and again, recorded delivery to the client to say, this is now the translation, the service has been finished, I'm going to deliver it. And it's been recorded. So there must be a dedicated and, again, traceable conclusion of the project. Say, I did send you this, how, on 17th of April 2009, etc., etc. So this is requirements in terms of the client-TSP relationship. Goes on to procedures. Well, we already mentioned that translation projects need to be managed, which means at least there must be a responsible project manager taking care that the deadlines are being met and things like that. I don't want to go into detail on preparations. You all know that there are some linguistic aspects, technical aspects, administrative aspects around the project. Clear, you must record the incoming of a project, you must record the start of the project, etc., and so on and so on. Then the standard defines the translation process and defines, and I would like to use now again the term state of the art. So this is what the term, what the standard defines as the state of the art, as the core process, which is the translation process. So this is the translation itself, of course. This is checking. Checking is done by the translator itself, him or herself. So whenever you finish a translation, you're supposed to read it once again yourself. And then, and now that's the big issue, the revision. This is something rather new, at least for half of the industry community. Revision as a mandatory step. I have to emphasize that revision as a mandatory step, which means revision is the act where a second translator checks the translation for its fitness of purpose. It doesn't mean that he retranslates the whole thing, but he reads source text and target text and checks whether the translation is fit for the intended purpose. So this is, in terms of the European standard, a mandatory step. And this is, of course, an issue for some in the industry because, well, at the end of the day, they say, well, who's going to pay me for a revising? But I can tell you that, as I have said in the beginning, if you work with a long-term client, at the end of the day, they don't care. I mean, you will rather easily be able to accommodate the costs of a reviser into the total cost, of course, which you have to transfer to your client, of course. But this should not be the big issue, because again, it's not retranslating the whole thing a second time. So it's a rather short process, reading it and checking whether it's fit for purpose. So this revision thing is one of the key issues of the whole European standard. The review and the proofreading is optional, of course. Nevertheless, this needs to be, again, agreed on, and this is also where, in my opinion, the advice comes in. Because if we see, again, in the automotive industry, if we see some complaints coming up about wrong usage of terms, very specific terms, then as an outsider, I can only say, well, this is what a reviewer could have accommodated for, because he or she would have been the one detecting the wrong use of the term, because he or she is the one from the automotive industry. Proofreading is something you do before you something goes into publication, of course, for a book, for example. It's the final step of proofreading. Final verification, okay, something you put everything together and see whether the agreed steps have been done. So again, this is the translation process, and again, this is why the reason why it's highlighted. Revision is an important issue. Yes, some annexes, again, these are informative annexes about, for example, how to register a project, what can be done, what needs to be done on processing steps before the translation has been done. We also style guides, things like that. So this is, again, informative. It's not the real, the mandatory part. So, are there any questions or issues on the standards of ICE?
What is the difference between translating competence and linguistic competence in the source text and the target text? Isn't it the same thing? It was two different points in your list.
It is two different points in the list. Because the standard defines all these 5 competences. If I may give the word to Gabriel Sau, because he is more the theories on these things. I mean, the point is, the standard says, well, how could I tell you this? Translating is basically the competence to transfer from one language to the other, goes without saying. The linguistic is more in-depth understanding how the language works, how the environment of the languages, the connotations of the words, all these sort of things. So it's a bit broader concept than to say, well, I'm able to Google one word, I'm able to Google the other word, and then put them together. So linguistic competence is more understanding, at least in my point of view, how the language works. I mean, I don't know whether
it was linguistic competence and the other was?
Translating competence.
Yes, because, you know, within the last years, the translation science came up actually. It's all this theoretical framework involved in translating. For instance, what Professor Bell shared with us is very crucial to translation science, all this ethical, psychological point of views, but also methodology. That's all involved when we talk about translation competency, and it's pretty much more than, as Peter stated, than to be able to speak and write and understand the language. This would be the more or less pure traditional linguistic competence, that you have a very, very good command of the language you are translating in your mother language, mother tongue.
Would you like to add that, maybe, if I'm not right, then sorry, like Ms. Tina said that in the context of one-two languages, in linguistic competence we can add that, but translating she has done for one-two. Well, I said that, like Ms. Tina said that about one-two languages, it's the same thing. Linguistic competence includes that you should have right connotations and nobody takes that in a wrong way. While translating, I could translate as one-two languages, but it was not taken rightly in Africa. Well, thank you.
To give you a quick example, I've got a big translating competence, and I already did that in the past, the framework of my job I'm doing. I've got no linguistic competence at all, because I'm a technician. So
is on standardization and quality assurance and quality standard. My question is all the 3 speakers, I'm really understand that when we are talking about standard, all of you have missed the Unicode, which is the worldwide coding standard. Maybe that for Roman-based languages, it's not very important, because there is no question, there are not issues of compatibility and other things. But as far as these complex terms are concerned, including all Indian languages, Indic languages is a very, very major issue. And I think this the conference should address this issue. And the standard of Unicode must be talked about. And it should be an integral part of the entire process of standards and quality assurance. Thank you.
May I take 1 minute, Peter? Dr. Malhotra has rightly pointed out the importance of Unicode, especially in Indian context, when we have 22 official languages and many more in waiting to be considered as official, and 1600 plus classified and non-classified languages in India. It is very important for us to have something called standardized fonts in terms of usage, and then these issues are probably currently being addressed by Unicode system. In this particular context, UNESCO has a committee. In fact, and we have a member from that part, Infoterm, to which Anja is deputy director. They have a project going on, and they plan to do something for India also. But there has to be some initiative coming in from the Indian government side and private initiative sides. Then only they will be able to do something on that. So I'm sure, in next lecture when we have tomorrow a conference, Anja would like to make some reference to those points. So that is what it is. Thank you.
Well, I'm only a student among all the intellectuals present here, so just have a small.
Its purpose and as far as this is possible at all, is free of mistakes and errors. Of course, first of all, I need to emphasize that also this revision thing is something which needs to be agreed up with the client insofar that he may opt out of it. And of course, if you say, for example, and of course there could be examples like this when we talk about minority languages, where we haven't got the human resources for a translator and the reviser. Of course, then what could we do? I mean, at the end of the day, live without it, live without revision. I mean, what needs to be done? So you might be lucky to find one competent translator for this language pair. Okay, then go for it and live with it. I mean, that's the only thing I can offer.
Perfectly right, but why the reason I was asking this question was that every translator has his own way of writing. The same thing could be written in a very different manner, in either a simple manner or a flowery manner. One of the either ways might basically attract leads to purpose of one client or the other. So what is it that
Well,
in this case division will be a little.
I hope that I got you right, that I got your issue right. The revision, and this is of course also something about training, in particular training and telling the reviser what he's supposed to do. And he's not supposed to do to correct the style, because as you correctly said, everyone has his own style. So it's not about the style, it's about looking whether the translation works, which is something different than to say, well, I would have said it differently, although you have said it rightly, but I would have said it differently. So this is not what revision is about. Revision is about, listen, it doesn't work, or maybe there's some mistakes in it, or whatever. I mean, this is what revision is about.
So there are more of suggestions or more of corrections?
Well, Peter, sorry, can I take a question from her? Can I answer her? Sorry, I mean, I find it important because I have faced these problems, when we started hiring freshers for our translation projects. Generally, when you hire a new translator who has not acquired the art of translation, they suffer from, these kind of problems. And this suffering is not only affecting the translator, it also affects the project manager who is handling the translation. Because each time you hire a new translator, they feel that whatever they are doing is correct. And this feeling, is that comes because of the lack of experience, and that feeling continues until and unless a project manager is there to pinpoint their weakness and give them detailed feedback on the translation that they have done. And slowly under supervision, when these things are repeated time and again, they start understanding the problems of translation, and then they start addressing those points time and again, and then slowly they get into the system and on their way to becoming professional translator. But for that, they need someone who guides them always. But otherwise, they keep on feeling that they are the best translators, and the agencies are the stupid ones.
And if
Excuse me.
if I may add on this very quickly, the standard clearly says that first of all it takes clear instructions to everyone involved what his role, his or her role is. So it needs instructions also to revise to say, oh, listen, this is your task and maybe this is not your task. And second, it's a question of course of a procedure which you as a TSB must specify. For example, whether you take the result of the reviser and send it back to the translator and say, listen, now you've got to make the final target text, or if you take the result of the reviser as the final target text to be sent to the client. It's different options, and you must specify what path you follow. But it's on you again, so it's about specifying clearly the procedures and giving clear instructions to everyone.
Any role in industry, they just do not care. We are too much focused on style things. If it's good English or good Hindi, the customers do not care. And the first comment, if it's such a less used language, what does less used language or minority language or let's say exotic language mean? If there is business in terms of a translation need, then it's not that less used. You could not find a decent translator via the internet. That's how our business is working now. You find any kind of language, and in that particular language you will find a competent translator via internet.
Okay. Now, may I request Peter to please close down. I'm sorry, we will not be able to carry on further on these discussions because this will ever-ending ones, and we cannot, come to conclusions time and again. So now we have my own presentation. Sorry for taking.
Okay. So if I got roughly right, I've got to finish my presentation now, which I will do. So for those of you who attend tomorrow's conference, then you will see and hear my second part of the presentation, which since we ran out of time, I cannot present anymore. So tomorrow then, I'm going to basically focus on the certification part of it. I'm not going to go into detail anymore on the standardization part. So you are heartily invited to join me again, and to join us again on tomorrow's conference and hear about certification.
I express my sincere thanks. It was indeed an excellent presentation on EN 15038, and we had a very great insight on how the project management and quality management, etc. goes on when we were to play as a major role as a translation industry in India, especially catering to needs of European Union. And of course, when we are talking about EN 15038, it already covers, the American standards, and of course, the Canadian standard has its base in EN 15038. So, if we take EN 15038 as the possible standards that we have currently in the world. So, it is my belief that, in next few years, this EN 15038 will continue